Psalm 37. It says that God is close to those who are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit.
Welcome to Face Chicago. Did you know that Aurora is the second largest city in Illinois, right behind Chicago? And did you know that its nickname is the City of Lights? It was named that because it was one of the first U.S. cities to use the electric streetlight system in the 1880s. Why am I telling you all about Aurora? Because Pastor Dan Haas is my guest, and he has ministered in the city of Aurora for over 40 years. We're going to talk about how Dan has spread the light of the gospel in the City of Lights and how Dan has seen the power of prayer make a difference in Aurora over these many years. So glad you're with us today.
Thank you.
So you actually grew up in Aurora.
Yes, I did. And like many people that grew up in Aurora, I was looking to get out of Aurora.
After college?
No, after high school, a lot of people leave, but after college, I was looking to do that.
Determined.
And I had a job with the Treasury Department, and I was supposed to report to them in the fall of 1974.
In Washington? In
Washington, D.C. And then, unfortunately, in end of July, beginning of August, President Nixon, without consulting me, had the Watergate break-in, and he used two two Treasury agents. They froze hiring in the Treasury Department, and that led to me staying in Aurora for the rest of my life.
So you had your career all planned.
Yes.
And you knew exactly the position that you were going to take.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then the word came down that there was a freeze. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. So in January 1, 1975, then I'd waited, and they told me that the freeze would be for 2 more years. During that time, I had done a job on the roof of Caterpillar with a roofing company,
yes.
Commercial roofing company. And
so from the Treasury Department to the roofing company, you thought it was going to be like a month or 2,
right.
Perhaps, and then all of a sudden you could see that like extend for 2 more years. And
well, I knew that I wasn't going to do that for 2 more years because I didn't want to get burned every day. But also during that time, God had really challenged me as I saw Aurora every day from that rooftop. Would I be willing to stay in Aurora and be part of revival? And so I said, God, I would do that. But then I called my fiance, who also needed to be willing. And she said, well, I guess if you think that's what God wants, we'll do that. But then she hung up and cried. But we did stay. And she was from Gary, Indiana, and we stayed in Aurora, and God has been wonderful to us since that time.
It's an interesting point. You were placed upon rooftops, or a rooftop,
mm-hmm.
kind of unexpectedly, but from that, God shared his heart with you.
He did. He did. And it was, it happened over a period of weeks as I would see this, and I had gone to church in Aurora since I was 7 years old. Gave my heart to the Lord at a Baptist church in Aurora. So I was involved in the Christian community, but I wasn't thinking of staying there, and I wasn't thinking that vocationally my life would be that of pastoring.
But you began to feel that over that period of time, and you were open to it, and the Lord was preparing your heart.
Yeah.
And so you became a pastor.
Well, first I went to law school, and then I worked for an oil company, and then I left the oil company, and I was in a home, a 12-bedroom home, where we took in drug addicts and people with alcoholic problems. And
talk about that a bit.
It was a different time period where the police would literally knock at our door and say, hey, we've got this young man or woman that...
And you're married now.
We're married, yeah, and living in this home, and it's a discipleship home, and it's a ministry our church did for a number of years, and we lived there 7 years. But we would take people in who had marriage problems or drug problems or alcohol problems and disciple them and lead them to Christ, help them find employment.
Did that have anything to do with your desire to start Aurora Community Church?
No, actually I'd started a school in 1979, a grade school, an elementary school, kindergarten through 8th grade. And a number of the teachers and the staff and the parents of that school came to me and said, would I be willing then to start a church? And so that's what prompted it. And then people at the house came along with it.
Well, so much more after the break. Dan has been on the front lines of ministry in Aurora for decades. Coming up, he'll talk about helping those who are dealing with death and loss, especially when those deaths are violent and unexpected, as happened recently with the mass shooting at the Henry Pratt Company in Aurora. That's next after the break. Welcome back. Today I'm talking with Pastor and Aurora Police Chaplain Dan Haas. Dan has been serving the Aurora community for over 40 years. That's a long time.
It's a long time. It's been a rewarding time, and we've had up times and down times.
All right, well, talk about the Prayer Coalition for Reconciliation.
The Prayer Coalition for Reconciliation, we started in 1994. We didn't have a big strategy or anything, but I knew that Aurora was deeply involved in a violence crisis. And Martin Luther said that if you're going to pastor, find the most important issue in your community and throw yourself into it. So the murder rate was huge. We were 3 times the national murder average for a city our size. And so I said, God, what would you have me do? And first thing I felt he said was to get contact with the Catholic priest who would do this with you.
So with the death count in Aurora over those years, you've had to minister to people who've had some, tragic emotion. They've lost their loved one.
In the Psalms, Psalm 37, it says that God is close to those who are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit. That's a very good description of someone who is a family member of a murder victim. It's immediate, it's sudden, there's no goodbyes, they're brokenhearted over the situation, and they're crushed oftentimes. And sometimes wondering why that happened, why it occurred.
Yes, why does it happen? Why does God allow such suffering and pain?
Well, sometimes we may give God too much credit for things that aren't in his, that he's not causing. People who are being murdered, there are reasons for that. And when a family, I meet a family immediately, the method of ministry to them is not trying to explain why, because I don't know why in every case. But it's more of, how can I comfort them? How can I minister the love of Jesus to them? How do I help them know that God loves them, cares for them, cared for their loved one, but cares for their family and their children that are living, and that he would like to be a part of their lives?
For instance, the mass shooting at Henry Pratt, is that what you did in that circumstance?
Yeah, that was a little bit of an unusual situation because everyone who was killed at that factory in Aurora was from out of town. So as pastors, we didn't have as much contact with the families as we normally do when they're in town. But we did organize a prayer vigil, which we do after every shooting. Most of the families had family members that came. We were able to pray for them, minister to them, comfort them. 1 Corinthians talks about comforting those who have been comforted as Christ comforted us. And God, who frankly lost his own son to violence and a violent death, knows how to extend comfort and peace to those who have had a huge loss. And that's what we've done.
So God never wastes suffering?
Absolutely not. We don't understand that, but many times it's in suffering that God gets our attention, because life is going great for us and we're not thinking about God. But he draws our attention through suffering, shapes our character through suffering, molds us, I think, for more effective ministry and compassion for others.
All right, we have just a minute in the segment, but practical steps toward healing. Can you give us a couple?
For someone who's experienced a tragedy, again, I think the most important thing is for them to call out to God and say, God, I don't understand this, but I need your comfort, your grace, and your peace. Because in the long run, that's the only thing that really matters. is that you know that there's a God who loves you, cares for you, and He will walk with you, whether you see Him or not. He is there with you in every life circumstance.
Will you give us an example?
I think of a young mother whose young son was killed by mistake. A gang fired into a home thinking that someone else was there and her young son was in the bed. And it was very, very difficult on her. She would get up in the middle of the night, go to the graveyard, lay on his grave. The family would get up in the morning, wouldn't know where she is. But it was sharing with her the deep love of Jesus, how God cares for her, is walking with her in that, will comfort her, minister her peace to her. I mean, those are only things that God can do. He does that by His Spirit, but that's the kind of ministry that you need to have with folks in that situation. Really, the why, we're never going to know. I mean, we know they made a mistake, but that's really not the bigger why. But that God can give you peace, give you comfort in those difficult times.
And only He can do it.
And only He can, yes. Only He can.
And He will see you through.
He will. He will.
All right. Up next, Dan will talk about the prayer strategies and community initiatives that transformed Aurora from a dangerous community to a suburb with a murder rate of 0. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Faith Chicago. Today, Pastor Dan Haas is talking about ministering in Aurora, which is the second largest city in Illinois. In the 1990s, Aurora was known for its violence and high murder rate, but now things have changed dramatically. And dramatically is the truth.
It is.
First of all, tell us about the 90s.
Well, in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, Aurora was in the middle of a big gang war over who was going to control the drug traffic in the Chicago area and distribute it out. And it was being distributed in Aurora. So there was a lot of violence. Now, unfortunately, many people took that people were just shooting each other randomly. That wasn't the case. These were very targeted, intentional murders. But that caused a lot of fear and apprehension in our community, and people who were not the intended targets were killed. So there was a lot of angst and a lot of difficulty. At that time, I started to pray at the site of every homicide with a Catholic priest by the name of Dave Ingbarth.
Yes.
And that was a very healing thing for our city because it had been divided by Protestants and Catholics for many years.
Yeah, what kind of pushback did you get from that?
Both of us got pushback
Yes.
that was something we shouldn't do. But in the long run, I think that the community saw the value of that, the strength in that. There was real healing. And today there's much better communication and cooperation between Protestants and Catholics.
So did your church support you in becoming so heavily involved in the community?
Yes, they did. I could not have done the things I did without the church's backing. They were very supportive. So we were, Aurora had about 35, 36 homicides a year. That's not a lot for a big city like Chicago, but our size, that's a lot. That was, again, 3 times the national average. So it took a number of years for the homicide rate to go down, but in that time, we were able to galvanize the church community. So it wasn't just 2 guys. It was many hundreds, really, of Christians in Aurora that were praying on a regular basis.
You started prayer vigil. Was it
We started
1994?
1994 was our first prayer vigil. And we've done one at the site of every homicide since. So we do 35 or 36 a year. So you were doing almost one a week at that point.
So after a homicide, the prayer vigil would come to that actual spot.
Actual spot. We'd invite the family members because that was very important. We began to invite neighborhood groups to come out with us and encourage the neighborhood groups to meet together and form neighborhood watch groups, work with the police department in forming those. That was very helpful because then the police began to win confidence of the neighbors, and they began to share information with them that was critical to solving some of these cold case murders that began to pile up.
And 50-mile prayer walks?
This going around Aurora is a 50-mile circumference, and I would I started a walk around the city of Aurora during the annual Week Against Violence every year in October. So I would take 3 days and walk around the city with other pastors, and we would pray together. Then we also started about 16 years ago, started walking through the center of Aurora from Orchard Road out to Route 59. We have 13 prayer stops where we stop at churches and schools and nonprofits and famous historical sites along there to pray about different aspects of our city. We stop at City Hall and pray for our government. So it's a great day. It's literally an all day.
So prayer initiatives, community initiatives, involvement with the government.
We did.
So you work together.
It was a collaborative effort.
For how many years?
Well, we're
10?
still doing it.
You're still doing it.
Yeah, so about
25 years.
Yeah, more probably. And we're still doing that. It was a collaborative effort for the Pratt shooting. So what often happens when cities are in crisis is that the business community and law enforcement and healthcare work together, but there's a missing component of the church, and we need to be addressing these issues because murder is a moral spiritual problem, and the church is the one that's supposed to address moral spiritual problems.
But I'm certain that through this process, there were murders.
Yes.
There were circumstances that were devastating, but you didn't give up. And this has been consistent for the past 25 years.
We didn't, because we felt God wanted us to do that, and I'm speaking about a group of pastors as a whole now,
right?
Not just me. And we began to see, in 2006, the murder rate took a very, very significant drop.
And what is it today?
It was in the low since 2010, when we had 0 homicides, which was a statistical impossibility. From 2010 to 2019, we were averaging 1 or 2 a year. We were less than 5. This year we're going to have more because of the Pratt shooting. We had 5 at one time. I think we've had 8 homicides this year, including the 5.
But the prayer will continue.
Absolutely. We're going to continue that. That is a significant reason why the murder rate has dropped. Obviously, excellent police work, excellent support in schools on character things, but the prayer has, I believe, a huge effect. Yeah,
a community.
On our city.
Your heart is in Aurora.
Yes.
And God gave you vision. What's next?
I believe that we're going to have a significant revival in Aurora. And I'm not alone. There are many pastors that agree with me. Several years ago, I think it was 2016, Chuck Pierce, who has a fairly significant prophetic ministry, said that if you drove a stake in the middle of Aurora, Illinois, had a 50-mile radius, that would be the beginning of revival and an outbreak of the supernatural. And we believe that.
More with Pastor Dan Haas after the break. Today, Dan Haas, pastor of Aurora Community Church, and I have been talking about his passion for serving the city of Aurora for the past 4 decades. We asked ministry leaders around Chicagoland what drives them in their faith, and here's what they had to say.
When someone goes from lost to found, from being abandoned to being discovered by God, from having their sins washed away and knowing that they've got a new name written in heaven, that never gets old. I can't believe that any Christian that would ever get old, that God would use them to be a part of that process. And that's what drives me.
I'm driven by the sacrifice of Christ for me. I'm driven by the love of God for me.
What drives me in my Christian experience is how real the Lord is in my life in terms of answering prayer and opening doors for me.
Knowing that one day I'm going to see Jesus Christ face to face. That drives me.
I think the thing that drives me in my faith more than anything else is seeing, as I said, sinners converted to the Lord, seeing families restored, seeing communities rebuilt, hearts and lives changed because of people making Jesus Christ the Lord of their lives.
Helping people to understand what it means to have a just society based on a biblical concept of justice, based on the teachings of Jesus.
I'm driven by the fact that I need to walk in a life in dependence on the one who lives in me rather than myself. And I'm driven to share that with others because I'm so concerned that Christianity has become Christians trying to live for God. You know, we believe in the substitutionary death. We forget it's also a substitutionary life. And I'm driven to help others understand that the Christian life is made in yielding and depending upon Jesus to live his life through us.
So that's what drives me now, is understanding how to embrace the cross so that the life of Jesus Christ can be made manifest in my mortal body.
So, Pastor, what drives you?
I think coming to the realization that life is very short and that people need to know Jesus Christ, because this life is very temporary. The next life is what's eternal.
There are a lot of good ministries to get involved with. How does one choose?
You need to understand what your passion is. What do you want to do? Is it evangelistic? Are you pastoral? Are you a helps person? And then see who needs your skill set. What is it they're doing that really makes you sense fulfillment? Because when we use our gifts and talents, we find fulfillment in life.
Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Pastor Dan Haas has seen great fruit from his ministry in Aurora over the past 4 decades. But ministry often comes at a great personal sacrifice. Yet for Dan, bringing the hope of the gospel, which has the power to transform lives, is always worth the cost. My challenge to you today is to look for a place in your own community where you can bless people in some way. Please know that all of us at Faith Chicago want to serve you. If you have a prayer need, call our Care Force toll-free. Thanks for watching, and remember that TLN is donor supported, so consider partnering with us. We'll see you again next time on Faith Chicago.